Hi, and thank you for joining us today as we dive into the topic of how workforce analytics, physical planning, and technology are shaping the new workplace. I'm Mary Beth Hamilton, Vice President of Marketing at Dataprise, and I will be your moderator for today's conversation. A few housekeeping items before we get going. The webinar will run approximately 45 minutes. It is being recorded, and we will share a copy of the recording and the slides post-event, as well as any other supporting materials that may be referenced or valuable. And we do ask that if you have any questions throughout the conversation, use the Q&A function in the GoToWebinar interface, stick them in there, and I will ask them to our speakers as we near the end of the presentation. Next, I just want to take a moment to share who Dataprise is if you don't know us. We were founded back in 1995. We have close to 300 employees across the United States and support a wide range of clients as their strategic IT partner. We deliver a range of services from managed user, managed cyber, managed infrastructure, but then also on top of that, we have individuals like one of our esteemed speakers here, who's a virtual CIO that works with many of our clients on strategic initiatives and HR leaders with items such as workforce analytics, which is part of the reason we are having this conversation today as we're all adapting to the new environment that we're working in. So with that, I want to take a moment and introduce my speakers. You will see them on video, but we've also inserted some screenshots here as well. I have John Rez, who also goes by JP, who I will refer to as JP throughout the conversation if you're wondering who I'm referencing to. But he is a virtual Chief Information Officer here at Dataprise and our strategic consulting team. He specializes in data governance, compliance, and product lifecycle management. He's been working in over 15 years and advising clients across a range of initiatives to transform their businesses and help ensure that business and technology are aligned with strategic initiatives and industry best practices. JP, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Next, I have Amanda Petruski from Bilalik. Apologize for my fumbling there. She's the Vice President of Execution Excellence and Director of Design. For over 30 years, Bialik has helped their clients create productive and inviting spaces with full service office furniture, interior module construction, and design services. Amanda brings over 25 years of experience in collaborating on and designing workplaces across several industry verticals. She's passionate about purposeful design and creating work environments for people to thrive in. Amanda, thank you as well for joining us.
Good to be here.
Next, our agenda. We are going to be talking about the power of workforce data analytics and how organizations can use those to adapt to the new paradigm that we're working in. We'll talk about building a business case and other considerations for the capabilities that are delivered through these types of technologies and insights. We're also going to be talking about physical office environments, how they are evolving and how you can build them purposely for the future of the workplace. And finally, we'll be talking about collaboration and physical and digital workspaces and tying in some technology considerations to enable collaboration, as well as from a security perspective, what you need to be thinking about to securing this expanded perimeter that we're all working in. So none of this will likely be a surprise. There are many different studies with different varying stats, but they all seem to point to the fact that the new normal is some type of blended or hybrid workplace, and organizations need to start to adapt and think about how that impacts their organizations, how they can plan for it, and what it means for their employees. So we've noted here a couple of stats. 73% of workers want more flexible remote options to continue, but at the same time, they want to embrace and be back to in-person work and that collaborative environment that existed in pre-pandemic. They want that in the post-pandemic world. And then 63% of leaders say that their company is considering redesigning their office spaces to accommodate this hybrid workforce model and the new model of work. So with that, I'm going to bring JP into the conversation. And one thing that we thought would be really interesting was first to define what we mean by the hybrid workforce model. So JP, before you get into the analytics, would love for you to talk this and sort of set the stage for all of our attendees on this.
Certainly, thank you, Mary Beth. So when we talk about the hybrid workforce model, right, we're not just talking about, having employees that work from home and having some employees that work in the office. There's the whole spectrum there. There's employees that might alternate between them. There's employees that might sometimes be working on one office and maybe a satellite office or like a hoteling situation. And as organizations are starting to embrace this hybrid workforce model, they're starting to see that there are benefits that can be realized and there are challenges, right? Some of the benefits include, for example, flexibility. As an employee, the ability to actually have the option to work from home might be advantageous, might increase employee satisfaction, right? It's also additional flexibility on the HR side. When you have the ability to open up the remote workforce, you actually open up your talent pool as well, right? You can actually start hiring people that might not necessarily be local to your headquarters or some of your satellite offices. We see also decreased overhead and hiring costs in general. Obviously, less people in the office means less real estate, means less HVAC, less technology expenses and whatnot. And then there's increased revenue and productivity, which we're going to talk about in a moment, how to realize those benefits. But there are challenges, right? For any organization, employers have to be committed to both employee experiences, right? The hybrid workforce model starts to fail, and we'll talk a little bit about that when an employer or an organization only focuses on the in-person, in-office employees, right? And the remote employees end up feeling less supported, and vice versa. Space management is extremely important, especially in the post-pandemic world. Not just in terms of social distancing and maintaining a clean environment, but just there's a lot more to it than that, and Amanda's going to be speaking to that in greater detail later. And then of course it's the shared ownership and trust, right? There's always a level of trust and shared ownership in terms of liability and cybersecurity risk and productivity and actually getting your work done when you're trusting employees to work from home and still accomplish all of their tasks and essentially be productive. So in order to understand that, we use workforce analytics. Now, workforce analytics is essentially a statistical exercise that measures behaviors of people and analyzes them in a way to try to improve performance of the organization. And like I said, that's decreasing costs, it's decreasing risk, that's increasing revenue, and it's empowering the users, right? So how organizations approach workforce analytics is usually based on what their priorities are as an organization. Now, again, post-pandemic, we saw that many organizations really wanted to focus on cutting costs. Maybe they had a revenue hit as a result of some of the shutdowns that they saw, so cutting costs becomes a priority. Same thing with increasing productivity, or perhaps they have a focus on starting to automate some of their manual processes, or they're really concerned, an organization might be concerned with all of the new ransomware attacks you keep hearing about in the news. And certainly, at least during the pandemic and in this post-pandemic world, we are seeing an increase in cybersecurity attacks and intrusion attempts. So there's a certain vigilance that is being emphasized by the cybersecurity community. And a lot of organizations take that on as a focus. And then, of course, as we're discussing today, that transition to a hybrid work environment can also be a big priority for an organization and can be heavily characterized in the business decision making by the type of data that workforce analytics provides. So I wanted to give you an example of what we mean by that kind of data. So there are a number of different tools out there. Software tools that either run on the laptops, endpoints, workstations that a person actively is using. There's tools that run on the back end, so your IT teams in your organizations are seeing that at the server layer and the infrastructure and the network, right? But there's a whole spectrum of tools that are available to organizations to allow them to start collecting data on their users. So for example, you might be able to collect data on whether or not a user is in a productive application versus an unproductive application or website. How much time do users typically during the day spend in social media? are a specific set of users more productive or are in productive applications more often and for longer periods of time when they work from home versus in the office or the other way around? Are there certain teams that are highly utilized, that are always working, that are working after hours, right? And possibly at risk of burnout? A lot of these different types of analysis rely on data, not just on, walking by somebody's office and noticing that somebody's on social media or noticing or hearing from coworkers that an employee might be burning out. Being able to have access to that hard data over time and seeing the trends as people transition to a remote environment or back, or like I said, those users that actually alternate. You can directly see the difference, right, between teams or between an individual themselves. This also helps with cost analysis, right? If your organization, for example, is spending on 1,000 Adobe licenses, but then over the course of 6 months, you see that only 30 users consistently use those Adobe licenses, then perhaps there's an overspend on those licenses or on software or on hardware. In the United States, there's actually $34 billion every single year that's used up on unused software licenses. So it's actually a really serious problem. So certainly there are many endpoint tools available. Microsoft even has one, but especially during COVID, we saw an influx of new vendors that are providing this type of data and software that allows the IT teams and HR teams to try to successfully capture what are users actively working on and how can we help empower the users that might be struggling on the productivity side on either side of the hybrid workforce spectrum, either working in the office or at home. So this is all well and good, but any kind of software solution requires a business case, right? Any kind of new paradigm requires a business case as well, right? The hybrid workforce, how do you pitch that as an HR team, as an IT team, or as senior leadership? How do you plan for something like that? Well, for a lot of clients that Dataprize has worked with, that, for example, is starting to explore this, they first develop that data-driven approach. We want to make sure that whatever we're doing has hard metrics that we can actively measure over time to ensure that there is an increase in productivity, an increase in employee satisfaction, right? And employee empowerment. We define what that hybrid workforce model actually looks like, right? Who makes the decisions? Is it the managers? Is it the employees that decide, should I come in on a specific day or not? You know, how do we give that decision-making power to employees in a responsible way? How do we explain liability to people who are going to be working from home? How do we delineate what is and isn't acceptable applications or hardware that they're introducing into the environment, right? So that all of that kind of falls under this umbrella of defining that hybrid workforce model strategy. Now, I'm sure everybody who's attending this webinar probably has seen a teleconferencing or teleworking or remote working agreement, right? With their policies that HR or IT might develop, right? And that's basically step one, right? And we're talking a little bit more about everything else that kind of goes into that full hybrid working model strategy today. And then of course, the best way to get anybody on board is to put a pilot program in place. So a lot of our clients are doing exactly that. They might say, all right, we like that there are tool sets that allow us to determine whether or not people are productive or unproductive, or whether there might be some kind of websites that we might want to limit, or there might be some applications that aren't being used as much as we'd like. So what do we do with that information, or how do we implement it, right? So a lot of clients are piloting it with a specific department. Say that the finance department is going to be operating in a hybrid work environment. So you roll out an endpoint tool like this to just the finance department and collect some metrics and data over time. And over the course of a couple of weeks or a month, you can present that to senior leadership and say, hey, look, like this is the kind of information, the dashboards that we're receiving. And there's a lot of decision-making ability that we're getting from this data, right? It's no longer just what do we think might be successful, but rather how do we measure that success and how do we, strategically implement over time that hybrid workforce model. And then of course, the users themselves, right? How do we empower that work culture? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the hybrid workforce experience itself on the user side. So if it isn't abundantly clear, this is not just an HR thing or an IT thing, right? This requires HR and IT and senior leadership and managers and the staff all working together to ensure that this is a successful transition, right? Engaging with employees throughout the pandemic, every organization had to redefine and revisit what that meant, right? Was it virtual happy hours? Was it all hands team meetings? Was it check-ins weekly or daily for managers, virtually? Now, when half of your workforce is in the office and half your workforce is working from home, same thing, right? Same considerations. We have to create virtual spaces, right? For them to engage in informal interactions. We still want to facilitate that work culture that you might get in an office. And I know Amanda is going to be speaking a little bit about that later as well on, how does that look now in the hybrid workforce environment, those collaborative workspaces, right? And again, how do we maintain that social cohesion amongst our employees that are in the office and our employees that are working from home? And then there's tools to manage space appropriately as well. Along with that spectrum of workforce analytics tools, a lot of those same tools actually do track where employees are within the actual office. And you can see the footpaths and where people generally gather, right? And I mentioned earlier that the tool set that you choose is very heavily dependent on your priority, right? For an organization that is wanting to decrease cost, they're going to really want to see all the different applications that are used and whether or not people are using redundant applications, right? And then in this case, for that hybrid workforce model development and space management, they might want a tool set that also includes, like I mentioned, the footpath tracking within the office, right? And then you have to understand it isn't just analytics and footpath tracking, all that of the staff, but the managers and leaders as well. I mean, if all of the leaders and managers are always in the office, then people start to think, well, maybe that's where decisions are made. And that might signal to employees that, look, if I'm not in headquarters or the central of authority, maybe that might limit my ability to get ahead in the organization, right? So how does HR and IT work together to make those decisions on, who should come into the office and how often, and how do we communicate that culture back to the users, right? So of course, the data that comes out of a lot of these endpoint tracking tools can assist with that. And this is an agile process, right? It's iterative. As we get feedback, as we get continuous metrics, as we see those metrics evolve, as we start to allow people to work from home more often or do the combination, as we develop staff enablement surveys, right? We can start monitoring the feedback and improve continuously on our toolset offerings and on everything else that goes into developing that collaborative workspace between our remote employees and the employees that are in the office. And we want to make sure that we use all of those in-person interactions strategically, right? They're extremely important to cementing teams, right? We know this, with team building is extremely important. There's been a whole host of organizations that after COVID have gone fully remote. Very famous organizations, right? Like Facebook, GitLab, all of them are completely getting rid of the real estate, but yet they still see how important it is to have those in-person strategic meetings. So they end up developing hoteling spaces or some small independent collaborative workspaces where they push for employees to at least get some face time with one another. So again, there's that whole on-site and whole fully remote and that middle hybrid ground. And that's really all the studies have been showing over the past 2 years that is the way most organizations are going and seeing a significant increase in productivity and a significant increase in revenue and a significant decrease in cost. So with that, I mean, that's all well and good that we're talking about all these cool software solutions, but then what about those guys in the office? So Amanda, if you might enlighten us as to the physical office environment considerations in the post, pandemic hybrid work environment world.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we've learned a lot about ourselves over the last year and few months, and organizations that previously questioned remote work quickly realized that work didn't necessarily have to happen in an office space. We as employees learned what worked for us about our remote physical workspace and what didn't. And whether you had it or not, we learned the importance of a dedicated space to work, access to good internet, limited disruptions, ergonomics, physical connection to others, and separation of work and home life. We learned how tiring and sometimes uninspiring it can be to work the same way in the same environment, day in and day out, sometimes in video meeting overload and sometimes in physical isolation from other people and colleagues. We also learned how different all of our work styles are and what we need in order to do our best work, because we're all unique. And the idea of hybrid is how to take all the good from the lessons learned and incorporate it into what's next for the workplace. And it's not a one size fits all. So wherever your organization is on its journey to what's next, deciding whether hybrid is right for you and to what extent you will be hybrid are all important decisions that you will likely morph over the foreseeable future. As we really are in unprecedented times, just like we were in COVID, right now we are headed towards the future without necessarily a roadmap with best practices and how to make this work. So as we return to the office in some form, how does the physical space need to change? Entering some of our pre-COVID office spaces now, we notice outdated meeting rooms, open work areas that don't necessarily support the type of work we do and how we work. We notice the amount of stuff in our office space we hung on to that we realize we don't need. What we need in the office is what we don't get elsewhere. We need to repurpose the office space with a more thoughtful shift to a variety of workspaces to support the neurodiverse needs of the workforce and different types of activities that we engage in. We need collaboration areas and social space. We need quiet spaces. We need meeting spaces with seamless technology integration that's easy to use. We need the chance of impromptu meetings with colleagues, and we need access to knowledge and learning. Whether you have assigned, unassigned workspaces or a combination of both, empower people with the ability to make choices of how and where they work in the office. Experiment with a reservation system, track room usage, seek feedback about what's working and what's not. Make your office destination worthy, a place where people want to come, not have to come. Next slide. In this image, I just have some photographs really to talk about here. This image shows a variety of private and semi-private spaces, as well as an open and inviting collaborative space. We've all experienced the efficiency that video meetings have given us, and they're not going to be going away. Providing smaller, more soundproof spaces for people to use when in video meetings will help cut down on the noise and the distraction to those around you. Next slide. This image shows another type of collaboration in social space. Very relaxed, more residential in feel, really meant for impromptu and general connection. Note the small meeting areas close by, along with a few semi-private spaces. Also introducing plants and other natural elements into the workspace makes it so much more inviting. Next slide. Smaller meeting rooms with seamless technology are a must. The user experience here needs to be better than anywhere else, not the other way around. If the technology is difficult to use and you can run a better meeting from home, then it's not cutting it. Selecting the right type of furniture and integrating the technology all needs to be part of the plan. JP, is there anything you wanted to add here?
I mean, honestly, this is probably where the majority of organizations might at first struggle with the hybrid work environment. It's specifically in these individual meeting rooms. I can't emphasize how important it is to make this as seamless as possible. Basically, somebody needs to be able to walk in, attach a laptop, their smartphone, get to work immediately. It has to be as plug and play as possible, right? And there's a lot of collaboration tools that are available, right? There's a lot of audiovisual considerations that we can provide in some of these meeting spaces that are on site and as well for our remote employees. For a lot of our clients, especially as they were transitioning to the remote work environment, who do we give webcams to? Are the webcams and microphones that are built into the laptop sufficient? How do we elicit that information, right? And how do we make sure that whoever ends up coming back into the office and is working with some of those remote employees have something like digital whiteboards to work off of, the proper video conferencing tools, bring your own meeting rooms. Do we allow people to bring their own devices? Do we set up a independent station for them to just use? And these are a lot of the considerations, and there's a lot of pros and cons to each approach that an organization has to have if they're going to go ahead and make sure that that hybrid work environment, especially in the individual meeting rooms, is successful. And especially, post pandemic, there's actually new technology that allows a lot of this to be touchless, right? Lower risk of diseases, contamination, and whatnot. There are gesture-based controls, there are audio-based controls. So making sure that we elicit the risk tolerance and appetite of the users is also important. If the majority of your users, don't feel like that's a major important, then maybe you don't have to spend that investment. But there are certainly, especially for example in the healthcare industry, considerations that might warrant things like touchless-based meeting room environments.
Thank you for that, JP.
So, and then, really just lastly about this, there's two themes that I've heard, and I love how they describe repurposing office environments. One is imagining office design through the lens of a library. Like a library, you come in when you want, you find a level of quiet space if you need to focus, you use the resources you need, you have access to knowledge, and you can connect with the community. I just thought that was such a fabulous way to sort of imagine maybe, what the new office might look like. And then another is thinking about the office as a social club or a collaboration hub. So it's a combination of sort of this library, social club idea. I think it's just a great way to kind of imagine what things could look like. And so in this image, you can definitely feel the social club vibe, as well as access to the outdoors and daylight, which is, the other really important factors, we're considering now in office space and design.
Amanda, and one follow-on for this one, and JP had touched on it earlier, is taking into account the culture in designing your space.
Mm-hmm.
Can you, in those two different scenarios where you outlined, can you talk about how you're seeing clients consider their culture in coordination with planning out these spaces?
Sure. I think culture, just like we're all really individual as far as people and how we work, companies are the same way. And I think, really deciding how to best project your culture and what you want that to look like and how you want people to interact in that space is really important. And it's really difficult. It's not something that you can prescribe. It's something that you have to develop with each organization so that the individuality of that organization really comes to fruition, because maybe they don't want as much of that social space. Maybe it's not that type of environment. Maybe the people that are working in that space are much more heads down, more research type, or more tech, companies or something, completely different. And so perhaps that type of need isn't as great. So I hesitate to sort of talk too much about that, because it really is something that you develop with organizations as you are designing their space.
Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting. And that makes sense that you have to understand the environment that you are designing for and working with and the uniqueness of it. So with that, JP, let's bring you back in to talk more about the collaboration and some of the technology underpinnings that come along with this new workplace that we are operating in.
Certainly. And wow, Amanda, that last picture, I need you guys to design my office at home.
Credit for that one, but yeah.
Right. Yeah, so we talked a lot about the space management and the proper space and environment for employees to have that, hybrid work environment. We talked about, that there are tool sets that are available, endpoint monitoring tools that an IT team can work with the HR to roll out. But then what about the rest of the tools that need to be enabled to support this, right? So obviously we talked about the AV considerations. That's extremely important. So for a lot of our clients, we ran staff enablement and staff empowerment surveys throughout all of COVID. One of the major problems that we consistently saw amongst the staff was audiovisual issues, right, with their counterparts that are in the office. So that needs to be something that all the IT teams that are trying to guide the organization into this transition need to be aware of and ensure that they get ahead of that. We talked about mobile spaces as well, and that's certainly an option for a lot of organizations. There are some considerations there, especially if you're hot desking, if you have some kind of dedicated workstations that people are going to go ahead and work off of. If you're allowing people to work in more public environments as well, there's a lot of security considerations there. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And of course, the rest of the hardware itself. What does a hardware lifecycle look like when you have some of your workforce that are fully remote or only come in the office every now and again, right? And it's not, not even just life cycle too, but what hardware of their own personal devices do you allow to tag into your network in any manner? Every single time some managed workstation or unmanaged workstation or laptop exits the environment and plugs into, an airport Wi-Fi or Starbucks and then comes back and logs in, to your corporate network, that's a risk, right? That's a significant risk, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about securing that perimeter, that expanded perimeter in a moment. But then digital collaboration tools are certainly available. So, you have unified communications as a service or UCaaS, and there's a lot of, examples of that. During COVID, we saw a lot of adoption of RingCentral or of Teams or of other systems and software like this to help with collaboration. One of the biggest issues that we saw when people were trying to roll these out was a lack of training. And same thing when we were talking about those the office spaces that Amanda was talking about in those meeting rooms where it's plug and play or you have some kind of technology that enables that collaboration. You need to train your users, right? Sometimes IT or HR teams might be super gung ho about rolling out a new solution, thinking it's going to help everybody, but then the training gets, there's a lack of training, and they don't realize it, and then the adoption fails, right? Or people are only using a software solution for 10% of its capabilities. I can't tell you how many times I go into an environment or new organization, right, as their VCIO, and they're using Teams as a chat client and only as a chat client. They're not aware of like the planner capabilities or the calendaring or the whiteboarding or how to properly structure teams and channels within teams, right? And that's just because there's a lack of training. File sharing and knowledge management. I cannot emphasize this enough, everybody who's attending this webinar. This is another huge priority for most of the organizations that I know that are transitioning. Actually, even for ones that are not transitioning to the hybrid world, especially those that are, right? When you have a decentralized workforce and you're opening up remote work capabilities for people outside of your city or your state or even your country, how do you share files between them? Are there compliance considerations in sharing files out? What type of data loss prevention systems do you have in place to make sure that those files, as they transmit to other people in the organization, aren't being sniffed out by foreign entities or aren't being intruded on? Or, unfortunately, the reality is, how do you prevent insider threat as well? How do you make sure that only certain people have access to your extremely important sensitive information? Again, especially since people are working remote sometimes and not necessarily always in the office, you can't, that trust that we mentioned before, that shared trust becomes extremely important. And then knowledge management. When you have employees that are working, on the West Coast versus the East Coast of the United States, there might be some proprietary knowledge that the West Coast guys have and the East Coast guys don't, right? How do you centralize all that knowledge, that proprietary knowledge? How do you make it so that you don't necessarily have heroes in your organization? And as awesome as it sounds to have a hero, in reality, it's not necessarily good, because once that hero leaves for whatever reason or wins the lottery, that's a lot of knowledge you might be losing, right? And we especially see that in the IT space when you have developers developing proprietary technologies for your organization and then they leave, right? So how do you develop that, the knowledge management portals or internal wikis or intranets, right? And how do you enable the remote workforce and the on-site workforce to contribute to that and to use that knowledge management portal to collect all this information and ensure that there are no informational bottlenecks in your business processes? That's another one, right? Whenever we elicit feedback from users, we always ask, do you have the right training? Do you have the right tools to do your job? But also, do you have the right information from other departments? And oftentimes you'll see, accounting might say, we have to constantly wait on finance, or an advisor team. Oh, we constantly have to wait on this information or research team. And there's a lag there. And we have to try to request for this information. And that might be an opportunity for IT and HR to come in and say, oh, there's a bottleneck between a remote workforce that's out, in another state and here in our on-site headquarters. Let's set up a portal for them. Let's set up a knowledge management location where they can collect this information and they don't have to wait on each other all the time. Or maybe some reports or dashboarding that's automated, right? And again, I mentioned to everybody that's attending this webinar, there's so many different tool sets that are available out there. Almost every HR team that I've spoken to since the pandemic started were not aware, for example, some of those endpoint tracking tools, right? Yeah, you hear sometimes some metrics being collected on like help desk systems and whatnot. But at the laptop level, with no matter what role you have, that's something that a lot of people weren't aware of. And we're starting to see adoption of it to a great extent. But that expanded perimeter, that last thing that I want to mention today is really, really something that I really want everybody to also focus on, because all of this is well and good. All these benefits sound great. New productivity, new ways of collaborating, that's all well and good, but it all comes with risk. And like I mentioned before, in the COVID environment, there's been a significant uptick in ransomware attacks and hacking attempts and brute force attempts and whatnot. And I can certainly talk forever about cybersecurity, but I'm sure everybody is, after the past year, has been probably cracking down, or at least I hope so. But in the hybrid work environment specific, like I mentioned, there's a lot of transfer of hardware, right? And a lot of transfer of data and assets between an environment at home and an environment in the office. So certainly a lot of risks. On the HR side, you want really good policies that transfer liability, right, from the organization, that directly state acceptable use of personal devices if you allow it. And there's ways that IT can actually segment, right, and compartmentalize your organization information from the rest of the person's mobile device, their phone or their laptop, right? So even though it might be their own personal Android or iOS device that's accessing, your email, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have access to the rest of their phone if you decide to put in some kind of controls to protect your organization. And there's a lot of ways to do that, right? And for example, one of the most popular methods is Intune, mobile device management, right? The ability to compartmentalize your proprietary organizational information and even have remote wipe capabilities on just that information, right? So it doesn't actually touch, use personal information and data and applications. We mentioned all those SaaS platforms that that I talked about earlier. There's a lot out there. Certainly, DataPrize was well positioned to assist if anybody would like to explore those options. But yes, even just a quick cursory Google search will show you that there's a lot of opportunity out there, depending on your organization's focus, like I mentioned. And in regards to securing the extended perimeter, there are specific tool sets that do all the other really cool productivity analysis, but also have a major focus on cybersecurity, right? And that's his fourth point, the user and entity behavior analytics. And all of this is under this zero trust umbrella. And for everybody who's on this call who does not know what zero trust is, it's essentially a strategy where you're locking down everything and then whitelisting the things that are appropriate, instead of the other way around, where everybody can do everything and we blacklist the things that are inappropriate, right? Inappropriate access from a specific country or specific geolocation, for example. The geo trust strategy is, hey, look, let's lock down everything, give conditional access to our users, right? So they only have the least privilege rule. And for all of those that are on this call that work in healthcare, you all know what I'm talking about when it comes to least privilege and HIPAA, right? Same thing with our finance sector folks that are on the call. Again, with PCI, with bank codes and SWIFT codes, right? You can't just give access to that kind of data to everybody. So the zero trust mentality is in data governance, is in network access. It's, you know, what devices are allowed onto the network. How do you VPN in? The whole 9 yards. But again, the user and entity behavior analytics. So what is that? So I mentioned those endpoint tracking tools. There are a set of them that fall under this UEBA or EUBA. Sometimes they flip the user and entity. Where it is a tool set that analyzes the actual behaviors and activities that are standard to a person's workday. So say that Amanda goes into her office and every single day she's always going to these drives and she's always doing this type of work and she's going to these sites. But one day out of nowhere, she starts downloading a bunch of client files. It's not really part of her job. She might have access to it, but it's kind of anomalous behavior. What these tool sets also do, besides this productivity analysis and besides application tracking and real-time tracking, is it'll also flag anomalous behavior like, hey, HR team, or hey, IT team, Amanda looks like she's doing something that's not necessarily what she normally does, and you might want to look into it. Is it actually data exfiltration? Is somebody hacking her account? She looks like she's logging in from Bolivia. It doesn't look like she normally logs in from Bolivia, right? So perhaps that's something you might want to follow up on. And you can tailor all those alerts, right? And make them automated so that the IT team every single day sees, oh, well, there's 3 users we should be following up on because this seems a little different than what they normally do. And we've actually actively seen clients use these endpoint tools to stop somebody that was planning to leave the organization from stealing data. And we noticed that they were downloading tons and tons of data, right? And we locked that down pretty quickly and then developed policies on the drive side to prevent that from happening again. Would you have known that without these type of analytics? Probably not unless you were actively looking for it, right? So this is a proactive way to enable the cybersecurity in your organization while also getting the added benefit of doing the productivity analysis and all those other really cool data points that helps senior leadership make some of these hybrid workforce decisions.
So, JP, before we get into final thoughts on this next slides and questions,
Certainly.
one thing that I would love to, because it's this interesting intersection of security, technology, and HR. How are you seeing those two teams or leaders work together towards a common goal? Because there's a lot of overlap, but oftentimes they can operate in silos. So how are they collaborating for the common good here?
I will say that one of the maturity metrics that the VCO team has whenever we are assessing an environment for the first time or coming into an organization is how cohesive the HR and IT teams are and how regular they meet and how automated the processes are between them. It is extremely important. The fact is, you're correct. Most organizations actually silo these because they don't believe that there's a lot of crossover. But just for example, in onboarding and offboarding, a practice HR has to go through every single day. There are significant components that are IT related, not just from giving somebody laptops or getting it back from them, but for giving them access rights to the right type of data, for making sure that we pull that access rights back when the person leaves, either voluntarily or involuntarily. So certainly we always push for increased collaboration. What that looks like for some of our more mature clients is usually standing meetings, bi-weekly meetings to say, hey, look, on the IT side, we're seeing some HR things that we might want to bring up with you. Or on the HR side, we notice that we're getting some feedback on some IT equipment issues or some knowledge management issues or file sharing issues. And it's an opportunity for there to be dialogue between both departments. But certainly, at least for navigating the hybrid work environment, it cannot be a siloed two-team approach. It has to be everybody coming to the table and IT and HR working together to create those strategic recommendations for senior leadership to say, all right, that's how we want to go ahead and move our business. When HR and IT come up with a business case and say, hey, look, we have rolled out endpoint monitoring tools like this. We have seen that over the majority of users are actually just as, if not more productive working from home. it may be a good opportunity for us to downsize our real estate to in some manner, right? Or to maybe perhaps start developing a collaborative workspace very similar to what Amanda showed. And that's the kind of feedback we're seeing, especially on the data side, right? We're seeing the user employee satisfaction are increasing with this new HR initiative that they're launching. And even outside of the hybrid work environment, right? Say HR wants to do a mentor-mentee program, right? We can actively see through some of the data analytics how developing a program and rolling it out like that, or a new collaboration tool, or a new social media tool, actively increases or even decreases the engagement of the employee. We actually saw that with one client where they rolled out a really cool internal social media network and everything. They thought they were going to let the users become more empowered, but the way that they rolled it out actually made it so that users were being interrupted too often, and their session times are going down, and they're actually being distracted more. And that was very clearly not what the organization wanted to see. But they would not have noticed that if they didn't have these type of tool sets monitoring, collecting this data.
That's interesting. And particularly, I imagine they can be alliances. There's a finite budget at many organizations. So if you can come together to build the business case unified, you may have more weight in getting it through. So with
Absolutely.
that, we'll do some final thoughts, and this will be a moment. If people have questions, I would ask that you send them our way. And any questions we're not able to get to during this webinar, we will follow up with you afterwards with the information. So with that, JP, you want to kick us off, and then Amanda,
Absolutely.
if you provide us your final thoughts.
So we talked about a lot of things today, everybody. If I were to ask anybody who's listening in on this webinar to take something away from all of this, is that there are more resources out there to enable your nice to haves and IT and HR wish list than many people might actually know, right? And workforce analytics is just one of many tools that can enable the HR and IT teams to actually have data that drives business decisions. We definitely want to stay away from gut feeling, ad hoc decision making, which we do see, especially reactive decision making that we saw as a result of COVID. Nobody was prepared for this, right? And shift to a proactive means of making business decisions by having historical data, by having the right tool sets in place to give users, the means to collaborate in the right way in a hybrid work environment. So I invite everybody who's attending this webinar to explore those options, to look at what's out there, and to realize that there's much more than just surveys to collect this information.
Thank you. And Amanda?
And I just wanted to say, I believe that many people are craving to return to the physical boundaries between work and home that gave our lives structure and balance, before COVID. We've learned a lot, as I've said. We've learned that in some situations we work better from home, in some situations we don't. And I really believe that giving people a choice about how best they get their work done, along with the importance of, the in-person social interaction that supports an organization's culture and innovation, is a win-win in my book.
Excellent. Thank you both. And I have a couple of questions here. Amanda, the first one is, many of the spaces you showed were very open. How do you help employees feel like they have their own space and that it's safe when they're in the office?
Yeah, so I do see this whole returning to the office as kind of a phased thing. I know a lot of companies are looking at bringing people back in stages, or doing it in groups at a time, so you can actually do the distancing, so that people, even though technically if they're vaccinated they should be okay, maybe that perception is that they just aren't ready, to be that close to everybody. So really looking at your office and planning out the distancing. And yes, I did show a lot of very open spaces. I understand that was more about like collaboration. But, whether you assign workstations for a certain period of time so that everybody knows, like, well, this is my spot when I come in, and have a sort of a cleaning protocol around that. If if that's what you need. Again, you really need to talk with the people that are going to be using the space and really tailor how that space is going to be used and how you're bringing people back. It's going to be a very individual thing in some cases that we need to pay attention to it and the cleaning protocol.
Perfect, thank you. JP, one question here is how it could come across to employees that some of these tools are Big Brother-like. How do you socialize these with employees so that they're comfortable with how the company's using the analytics and the data?
Oh, certainly. So with any kind of monitoring tool in general, or actually any kind of metrics collection in general, there's always going to be the feeling of, well, you're kind of spying on me or you're measuring my success in a certain manner that I might not agree with. So definitely has been a challenge for a lot of organizations. There's multiple ways to approach this. First and foremost, it should always be emphasized to employees, especially through policies, that there should be no expectation of privacy, especially when using, an organization's resources, right? And that should be something that is found in every HR policy book, right? The emails that you send out and the messages that you send, that's representing the organization in some manner, and IT should and usually does have access to that. But to actually give users that sense of shared trust that I mentioned, it always is pivoted, or at least for the successful companies that roll this out, it's pivoted in a way that empowers the users, right? At the end of the day, what are we trying to collect this information for? Are we trying to fire people? No, not at all, right? We're trying to make sure that we understand what it is that's allowing users to be most productive and what are hindering some of the productivity or some of their ability to do their job, right? And oftentimes what we find for some of these metrics isn't this guy is usually in playing solitaire all the time. No, it's more, we're spending a lot of time in this application because it's very manual, and perhaps there's a better solution out there that can be automated to reduce how much time somebody takes in that specific application, right? So the way the senior leadership communicates this out, right, and explains in a very transparent way what the organization's goals are with some kind of monitoring solution, and also explains how they're monitoring it, goes a long way towards building that shared trust. And that is absolutely paramount. And then outside of communication as well, right? At the end of the day, when you're rolling out something like this with a pilot program, that's where we advise using a pilot program, right? Because the department that volunteers or that is working with the HR and IT teams to roll out that proof of concept, they can give feedback. Like, this felt a little intrusive. This was fine. Maybe you're labeling Facebook as unproductive, but for the marketing team, it's very productive, right? So making sure that you're working with the users in that iterative process, that agile process, and you're collecting that feedback makes them feel like they are part of the process. And it's no longer something like we're doing this to you, but rather we're doing this with you to make the organization a more mature organization that can go forward and collect this type of data to make decisions that ultimately benefit the users.
JP, can I add to that real quick? Just
Certainly.
in regard to the physical space, if you are doing some sort of data tracking, let's say you're finding out that, 1 or 2 particular meeting spaces are getting booked all the time, and you're going into the office and you really want that space, but you can't get a hold of it. If you're tracking that, you can sort of figure out, well, why is this meeting space so attractive? What is it about it that works well for people? What can we do to create more of it? And gosh, we've got a couple of rooms over here that just aren't being used. What about those spaces aren't being used too? So you can really begin to tailor your workspace, based on the people and the usage. And that makes people happy, because then if they come to the office and they have the space where they want to work and it's available, they'll be much happier.
Agreed.
And then one question that relates to that partially is hot desking technology, and are you seeing that rolled out at companies and how that impacts spatial planning? And did you want to touch on that first, and then JP, you can talk through the technology perspective?
Sure. I think hot desking is a hot topic right now, and I think it's remains to be seen. I think that's going to be part of the whole trial and error process when people go back, how well hot desking will work. Again, with different types of employees and different roles that they play, I think hot desking definitely has a place, and really talking about how best people, store their things when they come in. If they need to have a locker or something like that, they can always go to, it's theirs, and really have that reservation system for a particular space. And I hate not having like an answer exactly, but it really goes back to the culture and the culture of the organization and how they want people to work and how they want that space to be available for folks, and whether people are going to share that space or is it going to be more dedicated for hot desking. So it definitely plays into the role, and it's all part of that planning process. And those are all the questions that we have to ask in order to come up with a space that's right for the company.
Yeah, and certainly there's software to support everything that you just said, Amanda. So, right, there's the real-time seating chart software and booking software, right? That's the basic stuff. Who exactly is using the workstation at one time? We want to double book the workstation. There's solutions like DeskFlex, Space IQ, a handful of others I can't think of off the top of my head, but and an office mapping software that goes into that. But to tie back to what we were talking about earlier, that Workforce Analytics also advises this. And so we are seeing a trend to doing some form of hot desking. And the Workforce Analytics piece that I mentioned allows HR and IT teams to determine which days and what times of the day are people most productive, whether they're working in the office or working from home. And how can we create a specific hot desk situation that capitalizes on those more, like highly productive time periods. You'll see that a lot of the hot desking software also includes a workforce analytics components as well. So I encourage everybody who's looking into that to try to find a software that does have the workforce analytics piece as part of it. I know DeskFlex does, I know SpaceIQ does, and I know a handful of others do as well, to help inform the decision making that goes behind hot desking.
Excellent, thank you. And that brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you both so much for joining us. To all of our attendees, I will provide contact information for our esteemed speakers, as well as a couple of resources looking at the return to workplace and the new paradigm, as well as the recording. So thank you, JP, thank you, Amanda, and I hope everyone enjoyed our conversation as much as I did.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.